Welcome to the Trinidad History Museum on September 14th, 2013. We're here to record some memories of Drop City. Sitting next to me here is Richard Kallweit, who is out there for right almost from the beginning. And I'm basically going to pass the mic to him and let him tell about. He was known as Larry Lard out there, right?
Okay, so anyway, everybody would have different names. Larry Lard was one of the ones that hooked onto me for whatever reason. We just make up names. Some people would make up names when some federal agents would come around and were snooping, so they'd make up a name, whatever name occurred to them at the time. Because there was a lot of activity that came around and got very well, too famous. So I was telling my grandson Jack that a lot of people thought we did at the time that we did too little, and then a lot of the time we thought we did too much because we had tons of energy. We were very young. And but the way I first met the people is I was in the University of Colorado as an undergraduate, and then my friend Clark was there as a graduate student working, and we were painters and artists at the time. And then Jean and Joanne had come through from Kansas where they were living, and they stayed with Clark and me. And then they left to they wanted to buy some land in 1965, and they were going to just have some land, and they could build and do whatever we wanted. So they bought the 5 acres of land out in El Moro, which currently, if you go out there now, it's totally sort of an industrial site. It's plowed up, everything's gone, but anyway, so it was at the time it was just sort of a grasslands and one big mulberry tree, a well, and it would go up into some cactus up on the top. And whenever we tell people that we bought the land they bought the land for like $500. And then I recently looked online to see what $500 actually was worth, and in today's terms, it's $5,000. So it wasn't a small amount of money that we actually paid for the property, even though we'd say, oh, it only cost $500. And then anyway, so I was up there in Colorado, and then in Boulder, and then I graduated from University of Colorado, and they'd already gone and bought this place, and then I didn't know what I was going to do, so I had a little Chevy coupe, 2-door car that I had, and so I thought, well, they said they were going to El Moro, and I didn't know where that was. I just drove south, and it was like rainy, just like all this stuff was happening, big mess, and then the road was closed, and I had to go east, if I remember, and of course the gas tank is zipping down like that. So I'm driving around, and I forget how far I went east, and then I drove around, and then finally I sort of looked up, and there was, the way I described it, and up on the hillside was a structure with a tarp over it, and that was it. nothing else, just some really primitive structure, big tarp covering it. So I drove up, and then, and I'd known Gene, and I think he wasn't that happy to see me, as it turns out. And I was the first visitor that ended up there. And then gradually, as then we built, other people would be attracted to what we were doing. And we had gone up and seen Bucky Fuller give some lectures. So the first dome we thought was a regular geodesic, but it wasn't. It was just something that they had thought was actually what is true geodesic, which is, it's just sort of, it's a spherical shape with geodesic lines, which are like the lines that are on a sphere that are the shortest distance between 2 points on the surface, because you can't go through. So the geodesics go around, and it's fairly simple. It all sounds complicated, but it's not. And then, if I lose track, well, so what am I trying? Oh, so we saw, and he would give, Fuller was, he came from far back in the New England transcendentalists, related to Margaret Fuller, who was, and some of the communities that were in New England in the early times. And he's basically a blue blood, which is, I'm getting at the age where I try to think back about what history is like. You know, he's related to the Puritans, way back. Okay, so so he had so anyway, he would give these lectures, and he would sort of turn off his hearing aids and he'd roll his eyes back, and then he would talk for like 3 hours, 8 hours, give these massive, long lectures. And he'd go up to the University of Colorado, had these World Affair conferences, and he would be one of the main speakers that they would get up there. So then, anyway, so Clark had finally figured out the coordinates, how to make a dome. So then he built, actually, everybody had left. I was down in New Mexico, and he was sort of there basically by himself. And then he had put the theater dome together pretty much by himself one winter. And what we do is we'd go down to, since we had spent the $500 as such to buy the place, we didn't have any more money. So we would go around to, there was a mill maybe in Pueblo, I think, one of the mills, and we'd get short pieces of timber, then we'd scab them together with another piece of timber. So we would have we'd have long struts that were maybe that big, because we couldn't afford to buy a 2x4 by 8 foot and cut it down. So we scabbed it together, and he put that down, and then then we had that structure up, and then we'd build these things, and then word would, people would come by. People from Trinidad would come by. Saturday and Sunday was a big place, another place to go to. If you're living in a town like this, what do you do on weekends? You can go hunting and you can go hiking. You can go out there and see what's happening. It could be, lots of people would just come around. And then, so then excitement would spread. And then one thing that happened was funny. There was this guy from Albuquerque, and he came up. This is a funny story, sort of. He came up, Steve Baer. He's sort of an architect, builder, and he had some resources, so he could do what one of those people. He could do whatever he wanted. Okay. So anyway, he comes up, He climbs up on top of the structure that was only 2x4s, and he says, "Oh, this is great." And he has, "I'm going to build you this, that sort of that long, you can see a picture of it, long zonahedra, called a garnet crystal that he was working on, made out of car tops." That was his idea. So he gave a blueprint, and then he left, and I saw the blueprint, and I said, he wants me to build a foundation. So I said, "Oh, sure." Put it in my pocket, and I forget about it because I was interested in, he wanted me to build a foundation for something that he gave me a blueprint for, and I just wasn't interested. So then he comes up and he says, "Where's the foundation?" So I said, "Well, I don't know." So he said, "Well, let's build it." So then he lays out the foundation, starts building, gets supplies, and, food. He sort of supports us for a while. Stuff, if you have a lot of energy, stuff starts to, it's like a magnet. Architecture can be a magnet. That's one of my ideas that I have, that you can, and it's current now. People, all sorts of places build architecture, and then things happen. It's like if you have a junkyard, people bring refrigerators, dump it off. Just, attracts it. So then he comes over and he puts that, and then he says he has this great idea for a kitchen. And okay, so he has the idea for a kitchen. He has this idea of these 3 geometric structures. And then his idea was to make them out of 4-foot units, so that each unit would be like a square or a pentagon, but it would have 4 feet on the side. And I think this was part of the downfall of us, actually. I said, why make it 4 feet, right? Let's make it 8-foot sections. But I was thinking it would only make it twice as big. But in geometry, if you double it, it's not twice as big. It's like 4 times as big or more. I forget what it does when you increase the volume. You can increase one thing, and it's so much bigger. So anyway, instead of getting a livable structure, right, which had a normal size that you can relate to, we had this massive structure that you couldn't relate to. We spent all of our time building it. It was impossible to heat. It leaked really bad, because we weren't in, it was like the idea of building things that were actually a human scale is a tradition that everybody knew about, most people forgot, and then we were going to reinvent the wheel, but that got pushed aside, and then later the idea of human scale, like these things, would come, adobe structures, would come back in a sense, and then when your brains get straightened out, let's say, or whatever, you're raising families, you want to have flat walls. What else? So anyway, so I would, like, people would say, "Richard, you've been there the longest," but I would go off for 6 months or longer. I had this idea that either if they got tired of me and dropped over here, or I got tired of them, then I would have a place to go to, down in a place, other different communities that I could go to. So then I would sort of help start those. And then eventually, the whole place exploded. we all left, and that was the end of that for us. And then it sort of continued a little bit, and then it all got destroyed. And now it's, you can go, you know, if you go out to Elmore, you can see it, what it is today.
Did you have some structures that were more human scale?
I can't hear you.
Did you have some structures that were more human scale?
That are normal scale?
That were more human scale? You were talking
Some of
about
the,
human
yeah,
scale?
some of the smaller, original smaller domes that we would live in were of a humans, you know, were
Yeah.
nice and comfortable for families and stuff like that. But and then we'd have some that were, but then, you know, this was 65, 66, and then the rest of the 60s came swooping through,
Yeah.
you know, and then, you know, everything, and then all of our ideas got submerged into hippies, drugs, dropouts, and stuff that we weren't really promoting or really interested in. But of course, I'm also prone to rewrite history at the same time.
Did you think of yourselves as hippies?
What's that?
Did you think of yourselves as hippies?
Um,
An identity that you had?
That sort of came a little later.
Uh-huh.
I always resented the term. I was just like I didn't think of my idea myself as an artist. People would say, Richard, you're an artist, and I'd go like, you know, Michelangelo's an artist.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just me. But as it turns out, I would just spend most of my time doing paintings, sculptures. Let me see. Currently working on whoops. Right now, this is after 40 years. Let me see. Well, I don't work with computers, so all my stuff is handmade. Still, I like the handmade stuff. So well, some of it's handmade. I don't know if you can zero in on that.
Yeah, I'll get that. I can do that.
This is a show that I just, in Holland, that I sent these images to. And they're mathematical structures. So anyway, I had a choice today between bringing my regular glasses with some clip-on shades, but I told Diane that I'd be in yellow, so I switched. We had these in the car, so I switched to these. So I was asked to talk about everyday life, which nobody gets into. People want to talk about obscure philosophical concepts, and everyday things were pretty much everyday things, basically. Basically, if there's a writer who wrote the the Border Trilogy, and he wrote a couple of movies that they made movies out of. He had these end of the world. I can't remember his name. Southwest, and then he had his end of the world thing that he wrote, but I can't. But one of his quotes that he had in the Border Trilogy was any woman that hasn't been raised up where there's an outhouse ain't worth a damn. Okay, that was one of the quotes that he had in his book. I can't remember the author. He's really good. And then he also wrote that book. Well, Border Trilogy was one of his famous books that he wrote about this area, and so pretty much. I would pretty much keep. I had my own vision that was just my own self-centered. When you're pretty young, you can be. Oh, and anyway, whatever upbringing you've had, your upbringing is determined pretty much by the first several years. So, depending on what your upbringing is, that pretty much determines the trajectory of your life. And without going too deeply into that, I was pretty sheltered and otherworldly and selfish. Pretty much didn't care about other people. Kept to myself. And then around me would hover all these fighting egos of making it. And like Clark was when he was an artist, and he would say, "Richard, we're going to make it somehow." And it was like we'd gone to some New York galleries, and he'd say, "Then it didn't mean anything." Because for me, we've already made it. I didn't understand the concept. I still pretty much don't understand the concept at age, 70. Anyway, so, I mean, even though we would take our big painting that we had to the Brooklyn Art Museum, and we had a show there. We put different stuff up. It was just another thing. It was just another adventure. So I was into adventures.
Can I ask a question? How many people lived out there at the height of Drop City?
Really weren't that many. You know, you could go 14, but then we had that Joy Festival, it's called. And then people would, I don't know how many people came to that. It was like, and then I'd find out that it was like various stages. And, groups would come, they'd disappear. So I don't know how many actual people were at that, what we would call our San Francisco Bean that happened in whenever, 69 or 67, I forget. But usually it was a small number of people. It wasn't that many.
Now, would there be families, like women and children?
There are a bunch of women with kids, some couples, single people. I'd live in the back of my car for a long time. We had some tents. Things would change. Different people would show up. People would leave. And, we'd have, originally we sort of we'd have a lot of things in community meals, which I loved because I could just sit up there, stare at Fisher's Peak, which I never painted for some reason. It's the most fabulous peak around, I think. I could look at it forever. So I would look at it, stare at it for the longest time. And then, there'd be a communal lunch, and I thought, hey, this is great. Show up. And then Charlie hated it because one of the guys that came later, he hated it. He liked it. He was more, he was like, I like to just grab something. So he didn't like that at all. And he was funny because...
I'm sorry, he didn't like Fisher's Peak?
No, he didn't like communal meals.
Oh, okay.
I loved it. Oh, he loved Fisher's Peak. Everybody loves it. Nobody. How can you not love it?
So was there a sense of when somebody showed up that there was some type of responsibility that they had to do to have those communal meetings?
Wait a minute. What?
The meals. Like when you had people come and go, was there a sense when they came to Drop City of any expectations of what they needed to do to enjoy the meals and to actually stay out there?
People would always, some people would come up and they'd ask me, what can I do? And I'd say, whatever you want. Instead of saying, well, we're building a road over here. Just, there was so much happening that you can, it was sort of like I would go down, when I live in Connecticut, I'd go down into the city and I'd go down to Zuccotti Park where the occupation was happening. And I was there right when it started. It was sort of interesting. And if I was younger, young people would hook into there and everything. And the concept was if you didn't make alliances, you'd really be lost. You just have to make one friend, and then, that's all you just need is one friend basically, and then you can just,
And you also mentioned earlier about how the folks from town would kind of drive by and just kind of check you out. What kind of relationship did you have from the people outside town that would just kind of drive by and, for a better word, just kind of gawk at what you were doing out there?
It was pretty good. We were sort of a wild bunch, so.
So would people from the town every once in a while just stay out there for a few days with you, or was it just kind of an unspoken?
No, there was sort of a, at the time, there was basically any drifter, scrounger, dropout, criminal could come and stay. But then, and this happens in a lot of early communities, there would be the townies and the college people, right? So there was still a split, which I didn't like, but it was sort of like that, it took I think it took years for, townspeople, outsiders, to sort of get together and, work out all the problems.
So did anybody that lived at Drop City, did they have regular jobs, or did you all just pretty much live off the land and take care of each other out there?
Couldn't live off the land up there. We'd get food stamps, but interestingly enough, when people would say food stamps, I'd say, Bruce Springsteen, when he was early on with his band, they got food stamps, right? So food stamps is not, the bad word that it was made out to be, has made out to be. Because, especially in the West, I mean, government stuff is like, who owns what, national forests, go on and on, land grants. And in Trinidad, this is like the center, has always been the center of all sorts of Santa Fe Trail, Ludlow, coal mines, Rockefeller, whatever. You have to ask a real historian to dig into the dirt. I just sort of skim over it. But I remember Charlie, is one of my friends there, Charlie, and he had his family and his kids. And he'd always say, all this communal stuff, it's like I really hated it, right? He says, it's like, look, you had Ed was one of the guys who came there, and look, you wanted he had a little Carmen Ghia, he was Chicago. You want everybody to use his Carmen Ghia. Of course, if you use somebody's Carmen Ghia, you're going to screw it up if you don't know what you're doing, right? And I left my pickup truck there, and it was a 49 Chevy. I had gotten it a new engine put into it with I forget the engine. It was really nice, and that eventually got screwed up. Partially my own fault. But anyway, so he was there, and he'd always complain about this, and I said, I left that Chevy that I originally came down there with, I had left there. So I said, I saw Charlie later. I'd seen him, he lived in the city. I said, Charlie, do you remember my Chevy car that you used in a movie, and the movie had you having some dummies, stick figures of police, and you blew up my car with dynamite. You don't remember that anymore. Yeah, right. That was our communal. It was communal, but if you weren't there, forget that what belonged to who.
How was in the 60s, really it was still pretty much men do this, women do that. So there was the women doing all the cooking and all the laundry, and the guys doing the building. How was that split up? Was it still?
Mainly it was split up that way because we didn't know how to cook. If I would try to do something, it would be like a total disaster. It got better when I had been in New York for 6 months and I worked in restaurants. And then I'd get a grasp of actually what food preparation was about.
Mm-hmm.
So after that, I could actually do something. But before, it was pretty much, because it grew up in the 50s. It was totally, split up between women and men doing chores, child raising. It would just break down gender lines completely. Which now I'm always shocked by how things have changed over the years. Well, not shocked, but happy.
Oh, I was going to ask, well, you had chickens, right? So, did they have chickens? That way you could have eggs to eat. And
Have
chickens?
chickens?
Yeah, and cow, like say, for milk.
We had some turkeys and chickens. There's a picture of our chicken coop that was over there. That was always a favorite, So we get eggs. But it was brown rice and beans, food stamps, commodities, for the most part. That was pretty much it. And then I could see photographs, and early on I could see our pantry. It was really well stocked, but that was a few. You get to a big certain number of people, you have to go into a different structure in terms of a communal setup. It can be, you're up till 9, 10, 4, 8, 10 people, and then you go up to 15, 20, and then it changes. It's sort of like small businesses now. Keep it like if you have 10 people in your business in terms of paying, because I worked in a factory for a long time. If you keep it, the law changes, but if you go from 11 people to 12 people, then you're in a new tax. Everything shifts, and you're into a whole new system just by going one person. You're into whatever it is. It changes. And what's curious about this, with all of our idealism that we had, it ended up that Gene Bernofsky worked for the post office in Montana, where he settled, with Joanne working in a school. Clark became an academic and worked the last 20 years in an art school as a graphic designer, painting, doing that. And I worked in a factory. Haven't gotten that far away from the way my father was, because he worked he was a new immigrant from Germany. So he was a pharmacist, but he couldn't. Of course, you can't get a job So he became a flavor compounder in some big factory. So he was good. He could count, but he couldn't going back into pharmacy school was impossible. So I ended up in a factory where I would do artwork of reproductions of antiques, bronzes, traditional stuff, lead work. And I was the machine shop, and I was the metal person, because we kept it stone person, metal person, assembly, and I was basically the metal shop, was me.
You talked about all the folks, and I guess what I want to wrap it up a little bit is, why did Drop City go away? Did you all just decide one day that you were done, or how did it fade out into history?
Well, there eventually were some tough times, and some people had moved off, and eventually I left to New Mexico, where I knew some people down there, and I could. But the thing that was interesting was, since I didn't know anything, basically, right, and I was still very young, it was like starting from zero. I really didn't know. I could build, domes, mathematics, philosophy, but what can you do? Basically what you can do. And I had to learn from there how to do things. Build, deal with money, deal with a family. All of a sudden I had a family. I had 2 kids, an adopted kid, my own kid. And we're living out. Somebody had given us an old Ford Woody, which I didn't even know was valuable at the time. And we went down to Bernalillo, and then up into Placitas. And we sort of camped out in the back of the vehicle for a long time. And then we rented a place, and then I built a house, and then started. And my dad would support me. He'd give me, you need a truck. Somehow I had it too easy. Things would vanish from me, basically. It was like, I'd get something and then I couldn't hold on to it. So some people came by and I'd wrecked the front end. It was stupid. I wrecked the front end of the Woody wagon. But I thought it was destroyed. Some guys came through. I'll give you $25 for it.
Okay, Richard,
Take it off.
we